The hunters were desperate men. They needed money. They needed escape. They took the tusk, blind to its true, non-monetary value. The ivory was an heirloom, passed down through generations of elephants. It was the only thing that could save the herd from the coming great famine. By taking it, the hunters condemned thousands of lives. Could anyone stop the poachers before the savannah itself ran dry? Watch till the end to find out what happened. The dust itself seemed to hold a desperate secret, fine and red, settling on everything with the weight of doom. Nolla, the great matriarch, felt the change in the land long before the first trickle of the waterholes vanished. She carried 70 years of memory in her massive body, a living archive of the great herds and the cyclical terrors of the savannah. Now, a different terror was rising. The drought had come early, and it was a hungry, merciless ghost. Nolla's son, Keto, a young bull whose tusks were just beginning to curve into impressive arcs, paced restlessly. He didn't understand the depth of their peril. But Nolla knew. She felt the subtle tremor of fear in the herd, the constant, low rumbling that wasn't conversation, but anxiety. Her eyes, ancient and wise, kept returning to her cousin, Jari. Jari was the keeper of the heirloom tusk. It was the sole, massive tusk of her great-grandmother, broken long ago but polished smooth by decades of care, and it was the key. Etched into its surface were the forgotten maps, the paths to the secret, permanent water sources known only to the first elephants. The famine was coming, a crushing, inevitable wave, and without the heirloom tusk, the herd would be lost. Nolla watched Jari, who stood motionless, guarding the tusk, a statue of ancestral burden in the deepening twilight. The scent came on the wind, sharp and alien, cutting through the dry, familiar odors of the savannah, human. Nolla instantly signaled the danger, a low, subsonic rumble that traveled through the soles of the herd's feet, telling them to scatter, to dissolve into the thorn thickets. But these weren't the usual, fearful tourists or the infrequent, respectful rangers. These were different. They smelled of iron, old sweat, and a primal, focused greed. 3 men, lean and etched by hardship, tracked the herd's movement. Their names were Rukia, the leader, a man hardened by years of failure, Jengo, the lookout, jumpy and younger, and Kalu, the tracker, quiet and deadly. They weren't looking for a herd, they were looking for a trophy, the grand prize. They had heard whispers in the dusty settlements of a mythical bull or a magnificent matriarch, a tusk so large it could secure a lifetime of comfort. They didn't know about the drought, the famine, or the heirloom tusk's vital importance. They only saw weight, volume, and cash. Rukia, sighting the herd through his rusted binoculars, saw Jari, mistaking her broken, unique tusk for the legendary prize. He saw his escape from poverty, his final redemption. He didn't see the map to 100 lives. He saw only the price tag. The attack was swift, professional, and terrifyingly silent. Rukia had studied their patterns, their watering times, their migration routes. He chose the hour before dawn, when the light was weak and the herd's guard was lowest. Nolla had stationed Jari near the center of the sleeping group, protected by the larger, less mobile females and the vulnerable calves. But the poachers were ruthless. They used distractions, a sudden, blinding flash, a loud, echoing crack that wasn't a gunshot, but an explosive firecracker, to sow confusion. The herd erupted in panic. Keto, full of youthful bravado but lacking battle experience, charged the wrong direction, blinded by the unexpected chaos. In the turmoil, Jari was momentarily isolated, her only defense the ancestral tusk she guarded with her life. Rukia and Jengo rushed her. Jari, ancient and fierce, let out a piercing trumpet of defiance, swinging her head in a desperate attempt to defend her precious burden. But the attack wasn't about the fight. It was about the objective. Rukia didn't shoot. He used a powerful tranquilizer dart, a silent needle of oblivion that struck Jari's shoulder. Within moments, the matriarch stumbled, her massive legs buckling, her eyes growing heavy with a terrible, enforced sleep. The air was thick with the dust of the fleeing herd and the acrid smell of the tranquilizer. Nolla, forced away by the surging panic of the calves, could only watch in horrified helplessness as the poachers descended on her fallen cousin. The sight was a searing trauma, an image that would be etched into her memory forever. Kalu, the tracker, stood guard with a cheap rifle, his eyes darting nervously, covering the perimeter. Rukia and Jengo worked with horrifying efficiency. They didn't use a saw, which would take too long and make too much noise. They used a large, razor-sharp panga, an agonizing choice of tool meant to quickly sever the tusk from the jawbone. The grinding sound, wet and sickening, carried across the thinning crowd. Jari stirred once, a deep, mournful groan escaping her chest, a sound that spoke of betrayal and irreversible loss. Then, with a final, sickening crack, the tusk was free. Rukia lifted the heavy, unique ivory high. It wasn't as large as the legendary trophies, but it was unique, polished, and carried a strange, heavy feeling in his hand. He dismissed it as superstition. They hadn't just stolen ivory, they had severed the memory, the only blueprint for survival that the herd possessed. Silence descended again, heavy and immediate, replacing the chaos. The poachers were gone, melted back into the shadows with their stolen prize. The herd returned slowly, cautiously, drawn by the profound distress signal Nola sent out. They found Jari, still alive, but grievously wounded and weak from the tranquilizer. The gaping wound where her ancestral tusk had been was a raw, bloody testament to the violence. She lifted her head, her eyes focusing on Nola, and let out a soft, rattling sigh. It wasn't a cry of pain, but a sound of profound apology and resignation. She had failed her sacred duty. Nola pressed her trunk against Jari's forehead, sharing a silent, agonized communication. The map is gone. The water is hidden. Kito, the young bull, finally arrived, witnessing the scene of his failure. His eyes, full of shame and rage, fixed on the bloody patch of ground where the heirloom tusk had lain. He didn't understand why it mattered, only that it was gone, and that his failure to protect his kin was absolute. Nola knew they had to move. The poachers would not return, but the approaching drought would. The clock had been set to 0. Jari died 3 days later. It wasn't the wound that took her, it was the broken heart and the spiritual severing from her life's duty. Her death marked the end of an era and the beginning of great uncertainty. Nola performed the ancient elephant ritual, covering Jari's body with leaves and branches, mourning not just a cousin, but the keeper of the flame. Now, Nola had to lead, but she led blind. Every direction felt wrong. The usual migratory paths, the ones learned through instinct and subtle, remembered signs, were already dry. They walked for 2 days under the relentless sun, their pace slow, burdened by the weakest calves and the desperate needs of the nursing mothers. The signs of the drought were everywhere: skeletal trees, cracked earth, and the disturbing absence of other wildlife. Even the hyenas and vultures seemed to have retreated, sensing the catastrophic shift. The herd was consuming its own reserves. Their constant internal rumbling, once a sign of social cohesion, was now a chorus of thirst and fear. Nola tried to remember the fleeting hints Jari had given her years ago about the other water, the secret path. But the memories were vague, incomplete, like trying to recall a dream. The truth was stark and terrifying: they were utterly lost in a world that was rapidly turning to dust. Meanwhile, the poachers' short-lived triumph was curdling into paranoia. Rukia, Jengo, and Kalu had made it to the edge of the protected area, hiding in a dilapidated cinderblock shed outside a small border town. The tusk lay wrapped in burlap, heavy and cold. It wasn't the weight that bothered them, it was the silence. They had expected cheers, a quick, lucrative sale, and a swift escape across the border. Instead, they found nervous whispers. The buyer, a shadowy figure they only knew by a code name, wasn't answering their coded messages. The ivory market, fickle and dangerous, was suddenly choked with rumors of a massive, coordinated police sting. Jengo, young and impulsive, started pacing, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool evening air. "This thing, it's bad luck, Rukia. It feels cold. It's too quiet." Rukia, usually steady, felt the same unease. He looked at the tusk. It didn't shine, it seemed to absorb the light. And the markings, those subtle, hairline scratches on its surface, seemed to shift and deepen when he stared at them. He dismissed the feeling as fatigue. But as he tried to sleep, he heard a sound, a low, rhythmic thump, 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 that felt less like a sound and more like a heartbeat radiating from the heavy sack in the corner. The herd's condition deteriorated rapidly. The third day without substantial water was a nightmare of staggering exhaustion. The mother's milk was drying up. The smallest calves were collapsing, too weak to keep pace with the rest of the herd. Nola knew she had to make a drastic choice. She couldn't save everyone. She gathered the core family, the young bulls and the strongest females, and made the agonizing decision to leave the weakest behind. It was the law of the wild, cruel and necessary, but it tore at her soul. Keto finally understood the true meaning of the drought. He saw the suffering, the inevitable cost of their blindness. He looked at his mother, expecting her to conjure a miracle. Nola simply pressed her trunk against his side, a silent instruction: lead. Go faster. Keto found a new, desperate resolve. He took the point, his youth transformed into a grim determination. He led them at a relentless, accelerated pace, following the faint scent of moisture that he hoped lay beyond the scorched horizon. Nola hung back, her head turned one last time to the dying stragglers, the emotional burden of the choice of physical weight on her back. The savannah, beautiful and brutal, was finally closing its fist. The buyers finally reached out to Rukia. The news was bad. The original price was off. The police pressure was too high. They demanded a significant discount and a change in the meetup location, a remote, heavily monitored crossing. Rukia slammed the phone down in a fury. He felt trapped. The ivory was burning a hole in his makeshift hideout. In a fit of frustrated rage, he yanked the tusk from the burlap and hurled it against the concrete wall. The tusk didn't break. Instead, the impact dislodged a thick layer of old, dried mud and grime that Jari's constant care had polished smooth. Beneath it, the true markings were revealed, not just scratches, but deep, intricate hieroglyphs, a language etched by previous generations of elephants. Rukia stared, not at a price tag, but at a story. There were shapes of stars, rivers, and a spiral that resembled the inner chamber of an ear. Kalu, the quiet tracker, a man who respected the bush more than he respected men, stepped forward, his eyes wide with a strange mix of recognition and fear. Rukia. I've seen shapes like that. Not on ivory. On rock. The old ones, they say those marks mean the hidden water. The Great Well. Kalu explained, his voice hushed with reverence. His own tribe, a people deeply connected to the natural world, had stories of the elephant's memory tusk, a record of their deepest secrets. He had always dismissed them as myths. Now, faced with the tangible, inscribed evidence, he felt a paralyzing fear. He realized the non-monetary value the synopsis spoke of. This was not a trophy, it was a sacred relic. The markings didn't lead to a gold deposit, they led to the last, sustainable water source in the region. He looked at Rukia, desperation in his eyes. If this drought continues, the towns will die. The water it shows, it's for everyone, Rukia. It's the only thing that saves us all. Django, listening by the door, scoffed. Water? We need cash, Kalu. We sell this thing and escape. Let the animals and the villagers sort themselves out. But Rukia, looking at the intricate lines of the ancient map, felt a seed of doubt, a terrifying recognition of the moral abyss they had opened. He saw the elephant's wisdom etched in bone, and for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of shame. The existential fear split the poaching crew wide open. Django was adamant, money over morals. He saw Kalu's revelation as a childish distraction from their professional goal. We finish the job. We sell the tusk, or we cut it up and sell the pieces. Rukia, however, was wrestling with the ethical burden. The idea of holding the key to the survival of the entire region, not just the elephants, but the nearby human settlements, was a weight he hadn't bargained for. Kalu, driven by a deep, newly awakened ancestral fear, made his decision. He waited until Django was asleep, then approached Rukia, his face drawn. We have to take it back. Or at least use it. Find the water. Rukia looked at Kalu, then at the tusk, then at the sleeping Django. He saw his own reflection in the tusk's polished surface, the face of a desperate man who had lost his way. The moral compass he thought he had discarded years ago was spinning wildly. He made a choice that would determine the fate of thousands. We can't take it back, not now. But we can use it. We find the water. Then we figure out the rest. The two men, former comrades, now uneasy allies, prepared to move, leaving Django and his gun behind in the dilapidated shack. Nola's herd was failing. They had covered a terrifying distance, driven by Quito's desperate pace, but they had found only dry riverbeds and salt pans. The younger elephants were now moving on sheer willpower. Nola saw one calf stumble and fall, its mother letting out a pathetic, dry cry before being forced to move on by the pace of the desperate group. The lesson of the savannah was brutal. The individual must fall for the collective to survive. Nola looked back at Quito, whose young body was covered in dust and exhaustion, but whose eyes still burned with the fire of his new mission. She rumbled to him, a complex, encouraging symphony. The journey is long. The path is unclear. But we must remember the shape of the land. She was trying to transmit the fragmented, incomplete memories of Jari, trying to piece together the map that was now in the hands of their enemy. She felt a profound connection to the land itself, a telepathic plea to the earth to guide them. And in the deepening crisis, a faint, almost imperceptible memory surfaced: the spiral. The image of the spiral, the sign of the Great Well, seemed to be etched not just in the tusk, but in the memory of the trees themselves. Rukia and Kalu set out before dawn, leaving the sleeping Django and their rifles behind. They carried only the heirloom tusk, a compass, and a meager supply of water. The tusk, heavy and smooth, felt like a lead weight in Rukia's pack. They used the ancient markings as a guide, comparing the shapes etched into the ivory to the contours of the land around them. Kalu, relying on his deep knowledge of tribal lore, interpreted the symbols. The star points to the highest shadow. The river flows from the stone heart. The spiral marks the eternal sleep. It was an abstract, almost poetic map, requiring intuition and belief more than simple navigation. Rukia, the cynical poacher, had to swallow his pride and trust in Kalu's faith and the ancient wisdom of a dead animal. Django awoke to the terrible realization that he had been abandoned and betrayed. The tusk, his payday, was gone. His rage was cold and focused. He found the tracks, two sets of footprints leading away from the shed, one of them weighted down by a heavy pack. He didn't care about the water, the elephant herd, or the famine. He only cared about the ivory and the money it represented. He grabbed his rifle and what was left of their ammunition. He knew Rukia's habits, his weaknesses. Django was no longer a lookout, he was a predator, hunting his former comrades. The money wasn't just his escape, it was his pride. He saw Rukia's change of heart as a supreme act of weakness, a betrayal of the code of desperation they had lived by. Django set out, fueled by a singular, burning hatred, following the fainter tracks of Rukia and Kalu, certain that the tusk would lead him to them. Rukia and Kalu found the Great Well hidden beneath a curtain of ancient, petrified roots at the base of the granite dome. It wasn't a pool or a river, it was a natural fissure in the rock, a deep, shaded cavern where water perpetually seeped from the earth's core, collecting in a vast, dark cistern. The air was cool and damp, the sound of dripping water a celestial symphony. It was enough water to sustain the entire region, elephants, people, and all the fragile life caught in the drought's grip for years. Rukia dropped his pack and sank to his knees, his exhaustion replaced by a profound awe. He looked at the tusk in his hand, no longer seeing a piece of illegal ivory, but a miraculous artifact, a testament to the elephant's ancestral intelligence. The great spiral marking on the tusk perfectly matched a spiral pattern of moss and mineral deposits on the cavern's ceiling. Kalu, his face shining with relief and reverence, looked at Rukia. "We found it. The elephants saved us all." Rukia knew their mission wasn't over. They had the water, but they had to guide the herd, and more crucially, they had to deal with the inevitable arrival of Django. Meanwhile, Nola's herd was less than half a day away, moving slower and slower. The collapse was imminent. Quito, walking on unsteady legs, suddenly stopped. His trunk lifted, not just sniffing the air, but feeling the vibrations of the earth. He felt a disturbance, a new, complex energy. Two humans were nearby, moving slowly, deliberately. But their scent was different now, not the metallic, aggressive odor of the hunters, but a faint, hopeful trace of water and fear. Nola approached Quito, her body trembling with exhaustion. She pressed her trunk to his, sharing the complex sensation. It was a risk. A terrible risk. But they had no other choice. Nolla made the profound decision: they would follow the scent of the two men. It was an act of desperate trust, a gamble on the slim hope that their enemy might inadvertently lead them to salvation. The herd followed Quito, their final reserves of strength committed to this last, desperate act of faith. The convergence was inevitable. Rukia and Kalu, having established a perimeter around the well, saw the dust cloud first, the immense, staggering approach of the dying elephant herd. Rukia felt a surge of panic. He was face to face with the creatures he had wronged. He clutched the tusk, feeling its massive weight, suddenly terrified of the herd's vengeance. Kalu, however, reacted differently. He grabbed the heirloom tusk from Rukia and stepped out from the shadows, directly into the path of the approaching giants. Nolla stopped, the entire herd freezing behind her, a wall of dust and weary muscle. She focused on the man, her eyes narrowed with suspicion and rage. Kalu slowly, deliberately, held the tusk aloft, presenting it back to the herd. He spoke, not in words they understood, but in a long, mournful, clicking call, an ancient, tribal imitation of the elephant's distress signal, followed by a beckoning gesture toward the granite dome. Nolla looked at the tusk, her gaze locking onto the familiar, ancestral markings. It was a moment that spanned lifetimes, the acknowledgement of the stolen memory, the betrayal, and the return of the sacred relic. She then looked at Kalu, her massive head cocked, evaluating the sincerity in his eyes. He stood unarmed, offering a gift he had stolen. It was the hardest choice of her life: trust the creature that had caused their greatest pain, or watch her family die. Quito, standing by his mother, let out a deep, challenging bellow, demanding vengeance. But Nolla felt the desperation of the calves, the profound wisdom of the ancient tusk in Kalu's hands. She made her decision. Slowly, deliberately, Nolla lowered her head, not in submission, but in acceptance of the offering. She let out a soft, trusting rumble, acknowledging the truce. Kalu lowered the tusk, a wave of profound relief washing over his face. The herd, sensing the matriarch's acceptance, began to move again, staggering toward the life-giving shade of the granite dome. Just as the herd began to file into the cool refuge of the well, a shot rang out, sharp, metallic, and terrifyingly close. Django had arrived. He burst into the clearing, his eyes manic, aimed not at the elephants, but at Rukia and Kalu. Traitors. The money. You think I'd let you give away our fortune for a puddle and some stupid stories? He fired again, the bullet kicking up dust near Rukia's feet. The noise, the aggression, and the smell of gunpowder instantly shattered the fragile peace. The elephants trumpeted in alarm, the calves screaming. Django raised the rifle, aiming at Rukia's chest. Kalu, without hesitation, yelled a warning and hurled a rock, distracting Django just as he fired. The bullet missed Rukia but ricocheted off the granite dome with a sharp crack, hitting the heirloom tusk which was lying on the ground near the well entrance. The tusk did not shatter, but a large piece of the tip, the segment containing the final spiral mark, cracked off and splintered. The damage was done. The memory was partially erased. Nolla reacted instantly, not with rage, but with a powerful, protective instinct. She charged Django, not to kill, but to neutralize the threat to her family. Django, panicked, fired a wild shot, then turned to run, disappearing into the thicket, realizing he had lost everything. The danger was gone. But the emotional cost was immense. Rukia rushed to the tusk, cradling the damaged heirloom in his hands, seeing the splintered ivory as a permanent mark of his own greed. Kalu, wounded but alive, helped him. Nolla, ignoring the men, focused on the water, leading the herd to the life-saving well. They drank deeply, the crisis passing in a wave of profound, exhausted relief.